So all of these things happened in BC. And for those of you who may have forgotten, BC, I mean, think of this as like the negative numbers on a number line, right? So the closer you get to 0, the later it is. So we're used to thinking that 1900 is something that's later. That happened later than something that's 1700. But in the Maccabees, something that happened in 640 actually happened earlier than something that happened in 620, right? So something to keep in mind as we go through this if you happen to be reading along, or if I happen to slip and make some statement about dates. Okay, last question. We'll spend a little bit more time on this question. I hesitated about this one. Somebody asked if the events that happen in the Maccabees are a fulfillment of the abomination of desolation that's mentioned in Daniel. So for those of you who are not familiar, Daniel prophesies, we have the stories in the first part of the book of Daniel that's about, him going to Persia, him in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But then in the later part of the book, we have a lot of prophecy and a lot of apocalyptic kind of literature. And 3 times it mentions that phrase, the abomination of desolation. And the short answer is yes. Scholars generally agree that this is referring to Antiochus IV stopping the daily sacrifices that were happening at the temple in his efforts to really stomp out the Jewish culture and assimilate them back into the Greek culture. And so whenever he made it illegal for them to have those sacrifices. He sacrificed a pig, which is a really big deal. He made it into an altar for Zeus, and that was, also a very big deal. And so the short answer is yes.
Wasn't a pig one of the animals that the Jews weren't supposed to take?
Exactly. Yeah, correct.
And that's why it's such a big deal, because they...
Right. It was an unclean animal. So it turned the whole altar unclean. So that's why we had to rededicate it. In fact, it was actually very interesting that whenever they came in to rededicate the temple and the altar had been defiled, they weren't really sure what to do with it. So they were like, how do we make the altar back into something that's clean? And they just gave up. They just they disassembled it, threw the pieces in a corner, and said some priest later is going to deal with that. And they just built a new one. And then they dedicated the new one. And they did it the way that it's told for them to do in the Torah, using unhewn stones and that sort of thing. So, yeah. But the interesting thing about that, right, is that there are... the fulfillment for prophecy is a much larger discussion, right? And so we can kind of hint at that right now, but I mean, you could spend an entire quarter talking about this. You could dissertations have been written on this, right? So, but suffice it for us to say right now that there are layers to prophecy, generally. They can be, right? So whenever God says in the minor prophets or even in the major prophets, I will gather all of the nations and people, he's speaking to, there's multiple layers to that. First of all, he's talking to the Israelites, specifically in their context, saying, you are supposed to be my light. You are supposed to gather all of the people, all the Gentiles, all the other nations around. You're supposed to be an example for them and show them what my love is like and bring them into my fold, right? But then he's also talking about Jesus, right? Whenever Jesus comes and whenever he dies, what does that mean for everybody? It means, it means that the gospel is for everyone, right?
And they don't have to do more sacrifice.
Well, I mean, he's talking about all of the nations are to be gathered to me. So, for I am not ashamed of the gospel for it is the power of salvation to who? All who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, right? It's not just for the Jews, it's also for the Greek. It's also in Galatians, right, where Galatians 3, as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to a promise, right? So Paul kind of explains that. Jesus coming fulfills all of those prophecies about God gathering all of the people to him. But then there's another layer, right, where we're talking about the end times. Upon Jesus' return, all people will be gathered to God, right? And it is unavoidable that you will be judged by him, and every knee will bow, right? That is another idea that can be encapsulated in this idea of the prophet saying, I will gather all people to me, right? So that happens. And so whenever we talk about Daniel in the abomination of desolation, Jesus brings it up in all of the synoptics just before the Garden of Gethsemane. So there's a lot of discussion about that. It's also alluded to by Paul in 2 Thessalonians. It's alluded to by John in Revelation. So what is Jesus talking about is that other layer of the prophecy. It's a matter of debate. I will give you 3 prevailing theories, but we can talk about that later. One of them is that it's talking about the destruction of the temple, right, in 70 AD, whenever the Romans finally do come in and they destroy the temple again. And that's what a lot of people think, that whenever Jesus is talking about not one stone will be placed upon another, he's referring to that as well. Another theory, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do it. I'm going to use some big words. I'm sorry. But a lot of people kind of view this as part of the timeline in the premillennial eschatology of evangelical Christians, specifically Baptists. So for those of you who are not familiar, this is kind of talking about the whole Left Behind thing, that whole idea of the 70 years and the 1,000 years and all that kind of stuff. So this would be part of the Great Tribulation within that timeline. Another theory is that this is just kind of symbolic whenever Jesus talks about this, about, there being a lot of trying times before he returns again, right? He kind of hints at that a lot too. Whenever he talks about there being wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and that sort of thing. A lot of people take that to be more of a symbolic kind of language as well. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't think that any of these theories are even necessarily mutually exclusive. And if you want to go further in depth on any of those, you're welcome to. I'd be happy to talk to you about it, but that is a topic for another class. So I have already spent way too much time talking about that, and we will move on to Maccabees. So I know we missed last week because of the storm, so it's been a couple of weeks, and just a real quick recap. The Jews were in a very bad place. Whenever we open Maccabees, the king is Antiochus IV. He is trying to do everything that he can to destroy the Jewish culture, and he has, in fact, gotten so mad at the Jews that he sacked Jerusalem, and he's made it illegal for people to do Jewish things upon punishment of death. So Mattathias is a holy man. He and his sons start a revolt, like a physical revolt where they start militarily, forcibly removing people from their area that are trying to enforce these policies. And they start off as kind of like hit and run guerrilla warfare tactics, just doing what they can, scrappy, scroungy kind of militia. But it grows and it grows until eventually Judas, who is one of the sons, he leads the Jews to victory over a guy named Lysias. Now, Lysias was Antiochus IV's regent. He's the one that Antiochus left in charge while he went to Persia. Excuse me. And he split his army. He took half of his army to Persia. He left half of his army in charge with Lysias and charged him to say, hey, just wipe out the Jews. And he was unable to do that. Judas was victorious. And because of the defeat of Lysias's army, he was able to take back Jerusalem, walked in very grandiose, and rededicate the temple for Hanukkah, which is what we kind of hinted on at the very beginning. So good times. I did mention at the end of last session that we were going to talk about Antiochus IV's death. Spoiler alert, he dies. But we knew that he was going to die from Mattathias' speech in chapter 2. Whenever we had the handouts, he was giving that blessing to all of his sons in kind of the similar vein that Jacob did. And so the quote that he has is that their glory ends in corruption and worms, and that was kind of really more predictive of Antiochus IV's death. It's actually rather anticlimactic. He got sick and he died while he was in Persia. That's happened the exact same year that the temple was restored. First Maccabees says that he died before it was restored. Second Maccabees says that it happened after. Doesn't matter. He died, and while he was off in Persia, either raising funds for his armies or for the Romans to pay them back, or he was dealing with a different uprising or whatever the reason. So Antiochus IV died, and that means that the heir to the throne is Antiochus V. This is the start of his reign. The only issue with Antiochus V right now is that he's 9 years old. And so he is not going to be leading anybody anywhere. Remember who his regent is right at the time is Lysias. Now, he's the one that we talked about that Antiochus IV has left in charge. He's the one that just got defeated. On his deathbed, right, Antiochus IV knew that he was sick, that he was going to die. He gathered his generals, his nobles, and he told them who his heir was going to be, who his regent was going to be. And it was not Lysias. Awkward. It was a guy named Philip. Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it. In the meantime, Maccabees is on a big high, right? Like, we just had this huge victory. We just rededicated the temple. And so now between 1st and 2nd Maccabees, we have 4 chapters of absolutely nothing but Judas winning victories. He wins victories in every direction. He goes to all of his neighbors and he wins all of the things. He just does a great job. His brothers actually split up, so he takes half of the army. Simon takes the other half of the army, and then they leave a contingent back in Jerusalem as kind of like the guard, right? He always acts as the ideal Old Testament general. The reason that he's going about doing this is just like in Nehemiah. Whenever they rebuilt the temple, his neighbors were not happy. They were kind of looking at the Jews like, what are you doing? You're just making everybody around us going to come after us. And we'd rather them not, focus all of their attention on us. And we'd rather you guys just be quiet about the whole thing. And we'd rather you really not build your temple again anyway. And so Judas goes out, and he is kind of obligated to defeat them and kind of acts as the defender of all of the Jews. So whenever these other nations come out and they start oppressing Jews, he's the one that's kind of coming to their rescue. But he's always left as the person that's, he's the hero. In all of the first half of Maccabees, we're mostly talking about Judas. In all of 2nd Maccabees, we are talking about Judas. So I don't want to say that it's sycophantic. That's probably going a little bit too far, but he's definitely the man, right? At one point, he left a guy named Joseph in charge of Jerusalem, and Joseph gets a little jealous of seeing these Maccabees brothers going out and getting all these victories, and he wants to go get a victory himself. So he takes his little guard contingent, and he goes off to some little podunk town, like he's going to wipe them off, and he gets defeated because he's not Judas, right? He is not of the Maccabean family, and in fact, anything that bad happens, it's never his fault. It's always somebody else's fault. I was going to read this section, but basically, he leaves Simon to siege these 2 towers. Judas has to go off somewhere, and in the meantime, Simon's men get bribed and let some of the foreigners out of the towers. And so Judas comes back, and he's like, come on, guys, 5 minutes. We can't clean up this mess. And so he puts to death the traitors that allowed those folks out. And then as soon as he's the person that's in charge, they're able to bring down the towers, and the siege is over, and he kills 20,000 Gentiles. So there's lots and lots of stories like that where it's just Judas is the man. So I think I've kind of hit that point really hard. Because of that, they're offered a lot of treaties. So the first treaty is right after they defeated Lysias's army in the south. There's this whole big to-do about it. It gives the actual word-for-word text of 4 official letters from Lysias and Antiochus V, who is, of course, being written by Lysias because he's 9. So it sounds good. It says, hey, Jews, you can be Jews again, and we'll leave each other alone. And they sign it. It's great. And then they break it immediately by Seleucids basically continuing to kill Jews in the surrounding Gentile nations. So it literally lasts a day. And then it's over. So the second treaty comes the next year. The next year, Lysias is able to regroup, and Lysias actually defeats the Jews. So the book kind of glosses over this, but it's important. Judas is seizing the citadel. Right? Remember that citadel that I said was going to be a thorn in their side for a long time to come? It's still a thorn in their side. It's right on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and as long as it's there, they can shoot bows at people that are in the city, and it's a pain. So they're seizing it. They're trying to get the people out of it. But Lysias winds up diverting him by sieging a different city in the south. And this is when one of the brothers dies. Let's see here. I just want to read this real quick. I know we're running out of time, but there's only 5 brothers, and so when one of them dies, it's significant. Judas with his army advanced to fight, and 600 men of the king's army fell. Eleazar, called Avaron, saw one of the beasts covered with royal armor and bigger than any of the others, and so he thought the king was upon it. And by beasts, it means elephant. So he gave up his life to save his people and win an everlasting name for himself. He dashed courageously up to it in the middle of the phalanx, killing men right and left so that they parted before him. He ran under the elephant, stabbed it, and killed it. The beast fell to the ground on top of him, and he died there. But when Judas's troops saw the strength of the royal army and the ardor of its forces, they retreated. So he died a brave death, but it didn't work out. So what winds up happening is Jerusalem gets sieged. just an exact opposite of the way that things were going when we ended last time. And it gets really bad. Things are going really poorly. They start running out of food. They start really kind of starting to get desperate. And then just when things are at their darkest moment, we're going to reach back. And remember that pin that I talked about? Philip comes back. So he had to come back from Persia, and he's got the other half of his army, and he says, I'm in charge, not you, Lysias. And so now Lysias has to retreat from Jerusalem and go deal with this. And so upon their leaving, they say, hey, we'll make another treaty with you so that this isn't all for naught. And the Jews agree to it, and then on their way out, they tear down the walls that they had just raised around Jerusalem, and so that ended that treaty. That treaty ended less than a day, so it happens. So what happens with the Seleucid court is that Philip gets defeated. Lysias is the one who stays in Antioch, and then some really complicated stuff happens. So next week I'm going to start projecting this up on the screen because we're starting to get to the point where all of the Seleucid kings are going to start running together, and it's going to turn into a tangled mess. But let's just rehash the events that we talked about the first week that we really got into the politics and the background of the Maccabees. So the first Antiochus that we're introduced to is Antiochus III. When we're introduced to Antiochus IV, it refers to him as being a hostage in Rome, right? The reason that he was a hostage in Rome is because of the treaty that Greece had with Rome. Rome kind of defeated Greece, but hadn't really taken over all of the territories, but they said, you know what, we will still control your rulers by keeping your sons hostage in Rome. So Antiochus IV was a hostage in Rome as a measure to make sure that Antiochus III did what he was supposed to do. Well, Antiochus III died, and Seleucus IV is instated as the king. His son goes to Rome to replace Antiochus IV, right? So the person who is in charge, their son stays in Rome. Instead of instating Antiochus IV back in Rome, back in the area, they instated Seleucus IV, and then they swapped the sons. Well, as soon as Antiochus IV gets back, he assassinates Seleucus and takes the throne. Now, Seleucus's son remained in Rome this whole time because Antiochus V was never old enough to make the swap, right? They weren't going to have like an infant son there. So Seleucus IV, his son's name is Demetrius, and he was not instated whenever Antiochus IV died, because you would think that when Antiochus IV died, you had this guy that you've been holding hostage. Why wouldn't you make him the guy that's in charge? Because Antiochus V was a kid, and they basically thought it'd be easier to control a kid than it would be just to have somebody's son as hostage. Like, having a kid is a better way for us to maintain control than it would be for us to have a son hostage. But what winds up happening is that Rome sends an emissary to make sure that the Greeks are doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, and they're not. They find a lot of violations of this treaty. Remember the things that I said that they were supposed to do? They were supposed to limit the number of ships that they had and the size of their armies and, the number of elephants they had and all that sort of thing. And they hadn't been doing that. They've been building their army. And so the Romans came in and just hamstringed the elephants and sank the ships and said, you will adhere to this treaty. And in the mess of all of this, Demetrius winds up escaping Rome, and he claims the throne. And he immediately kills both Antiochus V and Lysias, and he calls himself Demetrius the First Soter, which, for those of you who know Greek, you know that soter means savior. So, man, these guys are just really all in on themselves. We've got 5 minutes left, and I'm a little bit hesitant to open this can of worms right now, but I am going to kind of give you a little bit of food for thought. This is in our readings for the time that we had covered today, and I just want to kind of get your juices flowing. Just kind of think about this for a little bit. This is 2 Maccabees chapter 12, verse 38. Judas rallied his army and went to the city of Edulon. As the seventh day was approaching, they purified themselves according to custom and kept the Sabbath there. Remember, they always do the right Jewish things. On the following day, since the task had now become urgent, Judas and his companions went up to gather the bodies of the fallen and bury them with their kindred in their ancestral tombs. So they had just had a battle, but they didn't want to, right after the battle was the Sabbath. So they upheld the Sabbath, but now all of these bodies are still laying out in the fields. So they go up to bury them. And under the tunic of each of the dead, they found amulets sacred to the idols of Jamnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear. So it was clear that this was why these men had fallen. They all therefore praised the ways of the Lord, the just judge, who brings to light the things that are hidden. Turning to supplication, they prayed that the sinful deed might be fully blotted out. The noble Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened because of the sin of those who had fallen. He then took up a collection among all his soldiers, amounting to 2,000 silver drachmas, which he sent to Jerusalem to provide for an expiatory sacrifice. And in doing this, he acted in a very excellent and noble way, insomuch as he had the resurrection in mind. For if he were not expecting the fallen to rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he did this with a view to the splendid reward that awaits those who had gone to rest in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Thus he made atonement for the dead, that they might be absolved from their sin. Now, if that language sounds familiar, that's because this is a Catholic translation, right? And, that's kind of the language that you would expect to hear. This passage is one of the primary arguments that Protestants use for not having the Maccabees in the canon, is this idea of praying for the dead. And if we go back to this Old Testament exegesis, right, what this would have meant for the people who originally read this, they would have thought about this as like a collective guilt kind of issue at first. Right, so like you think of in Joshua chapter 7, whenever they had wiped out Jericho and one guy had stolen an idol. So the next place that they went to, which was just this little podunk town, they all got wiped out. And they said, well, why did we get wiped out? And they found out it was because one guy had stolen an idol. And so everybody had got punished. And so the author of the Maccabees takes time to explain that this is not the case here. This is the Judas did this because of this resurrection language, not because he was trying to sacrifice and ask forgiveness for the collective of the Jews. Right. So the question is, what do you think about that? Right? There's no right or wrong answer here. I've got my own thoughts, but, the early church fathers, remember, this was translated with the Septuagint. So they would have all had access to this, and by and large, 1,300 years of Catholicism, I can speak, have celebrated an All Souls Day. Right? It's in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Tertullian and Augustine and all of these kind of church fathers that you've heard of were all cool with this. It wasn't until Martin Luther and Calvin came along when they said that's not what we're about, right? We're not going to pray for the dead. There's actually several schools of thought about this in Judaism as well. They're a little bit divided on this. And you have this idea at the beginning of the Old Testament of Sheol, right, which is just kind of like a holding place. And then they realize that Sheol may just be a holding place until the resurrection, which is what the Mishnah really kind of teaches, which is another one of those intertestamental texts. That's a commentary on the Talmud, basically. So something to think about for next time, something to kind of get your juices flowing. I encourage you to look it up, and I would encourage discussion. But we're out of time now. Otherwise, we would totally have a discussion, but sorry. I know some of y'all are just dying to let me know your thoughts. So next time, we'll talk about the reign of Demetrius Soter. And that next time will take us through the end of 2 Maccabees. So thank you for listening.